You can't seem to reproduce any cinematic green screen footage? Then this tutorial should help you with that process. Tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to the last syllable of recorded time, till all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. An out brief candle. Life is but a walking shadow. Poor player that struts and frets its hour upon this stage, and is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. So I discovered Kevin James's YouTube channel during lockdown. I was really impressed with the filmmaking collaborators, the Canine brothers, and their use of realistic green screen footage in Kevin's Soundman sketches, which got me thinking whether I could recreate similar scenes myself with just a basic green screen backdrop with the gear I currently own. The idea of making a short film entirely made up of green screen footage was then planted in my mind. If I could learn how to produce high production value looking shorts, sketches, or scenes with just basic green screen footage, that would be a great success. So I thought I would share my findings thus far on my experimentation. I hoped you enjoyed my example shot at the beginning of the video, and I'll break down how I achieved this shot throughout this tutorial. To be honest, I couldn't find any realistic examples of good green screen technique in other tutorials on YouTube. However, I'm in no way saying that I'm an expert in this field, but I thought I'd share some of the useful tips that I discovered in developing my own method. And please drop me a comment if there's any elements I'm unaware of and can improve upon. Okay, let's get into it. Up until 2 weeks ago, I had never attempted any green screening before. However, I've been filmmaking consistently for the past 3 years now, and I've cut together enough videos to give me a basic understanding of what a realistic green screen shot may require. Here are some of the shooting techniques that were fairly obvious to me once I started experimenting because of my previous experiments, but I feel are not mentioned in other tutorials I've seen, or they're executed poorly in their lighting and framing. Using a camera with a 10-bit or 12-bit color depth or higher is essential. I was using the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. I usually shoot in 12-bit RAW, but for this experiment I was shooting in 10-bit ProRes so I could bring the clip into After Effects without any major issues. Shooting a log profile is also really important so you can match the background shot with the JPEG or video in post-production. Picking the same or similar focal length as the scene you're imposing yourself into is paramount for it to sell. Without considering this step beforehand will likely lead to a final shot which looks weird and has an unrealistic perspective. No amount of lighting or post-production can correct this issue. I heavily diffused the key light in my shot to match the artificial light coming through the window from the Assassin's Creed shot that I used in the example footage. It's paramount that the light source you're copying doesn't look like a synthetic source unless the backdrop image that you're using has a synthetic light source in it. The light I was using was the 120D with a softbox with an extra layer of diffusion in front of it. Get the perspective of your shot as close to the image you're working with. I used the still from the film Assassin's Creed for my example footage. I then roughly removed Fastblender from the still with the Photoshop before bringing it into After Effects. My first attempts were basically just blind experiments that I knew wouldn't sell, but this would be a good base for me to learn the required skill sets by repeating the process numerous times. This would also allow me to see how many problems I could fix in post-production, having conducted several experiments before using a working example. Another tip I learned through the experimentation phase was the importance on having clear foreground, middle ground and background perspective to give your image depth of field. So I positioned my hands out of focus in the foreground and my face in the middle ground in focus, and the Assassin's Creed clip clearly giving depth of field in the background. This use of framing and basic perspective really helps to sell the image just that much more. All these subtle considerations add up to a better final result. In one of my experiments, I was wearing a maroon jumper, and the Assassin's Creed clip I was using was predominantly desaturated teal grey. The maroon of my jumper did not help sell the shot, and it was neither complementary or close to the teal color in the Assassin's Creed JPEG. So when I was using Color Matcher to sell it in After Effects, this was too much of a juxtaposition to make the two shots blend together realistically, and I couldn't get the light wrap plugin to sell realistically either. Light your green screen as evenly as possible to try to remove the creases in the backdrop, and use depth of field with your lens choice to smooth out the background even further. All these elements will add up to a much better, cleaner key overall. You're trying to protect your image from losing quality when applying key light in post-production. In this tutorial, I will not be covering key light within After Effects. I recommend you check out Filmright's latest tutorial on keying for an in-depth guide on key light and other helpful plugins. Light your scene as close to your background shot as you can. As you can see from my first experiments were about just trying to get the smoothest key as possible, but the lighting clearly doesn't match, and there's no hair light in the Assassin's Creed scene. I knew my shot would not initially match, but this was just part of my overall experimentation. The second issue I knew wouldn't sell was the shadow side on my face had some fill in my scene and not in the Assassin's Creed shot. My scene actually needs a negative fill to help it sell with the background image, and I did just that in my final experimentation. If the lighting doesn't match your background image, you'll get this cardboard cutout effect that you can't really solve in post-production. Using a gradient power window and adjusting the exposure might help reduce this unwanted quality, but it will unlikely cover the poor lighting technique you started with. I've switched to DaVinci Resolve this last year for all my editing purposes, so I attempted my first key in Resolve's Fusion tab. I watched a few tutorials on how to use the Delta keyer and the clean plate in the Fusion using their node-based system as opposed to the layer system in After Effects. I was somewhat familiar with the Fusion tab before executing these experiments. However, I ran into some issues. I think this is just an inexperience on my part with using Fusion, but I couldn't seem to get close to any realistic key using the footage I shot, and none of the tutorials I found were much help in this area either. There are two really important tools and plugins that Fusion doesn't seem to have that After Effects does. They are Red Giant's Light Wrap and Color Matcher. If anyone down in the comment section has any solutions to these tools in Resolve, do let me know. So I switched back to After Effects for my key. I'm much more familiar with After Effects. I've over 3 years of experience using After Effects. Also, there seems to be more tutorials about keying on YouTube in After Effects. I wanted to move back to Resolve once I finished the basic keys so I could take advantage of the superior grading software in Resolve. I think other tutorials on green screening don't stress the importance of one's ability to color grade enough. I think this is an integral part to making your footage sell in the final result. If you're inexperienced at matching clips in the grade, you're going to find this process very difficult. So if you haven't much experience in grading and matching the continuity of different shots, then I wouldn't recommend experimenting with realistic green screen before you've reached an intermediate level at color grading and color matching. Bringing it back into Resolve once I got the saturation and overall exposure as close as I could in the Assassin's Creed clip in After Effects. I exported it using Adobe Medium Coder in H.264, the highest bitrate possible, so that the clip wouldn't break apart further with further grading in Resolve. These are the steps that work for me, although every shot you're working with on will have its own individual post-production requirements. Using a power window to bring down the exposure with a vignette, so we're focusing mainly on the actor's face as opposed to the background or anything else that exposes the falseness of the image. Manipulating hue versus hue to bring my shirt closer to the teal of the background. Adding some film grain to the overall image to make the background sell as if it were a moving image and not just a JPEG. Panning in slowly to further sell the key, distracting the viewer from any other falseness of the shot. Adding a light flicker, turning down the randomness and the speed to the flicker to imitate a false daylight coming into the room. Don't overdo this flicker effect or it'll look unnatural. Using a glow effect to lightly animate the highlights of the background image. Some additional lens blurring using a power window and keyframing so it's more blurry as the image zooms in, faking this lens racking focus effect. And finally, I added some additional sharpening using a power window on my face to separate it from the background shot. I spent about 25 hours of trial and error to make the shot fit realistically with the Assassin's Creed clip. This tutorial is just a brief overview of the successful experiments. I'm glad I took the time to understand the process by doing extensive experimentation, and I didn't just do what I normally do, which is watch a bunch of tutorials and do none of the testing myself. While I've only one clip of high quality to show for it, this experiment has offered me further insight to other potential ideas I may pursue in the future. This is one of the benefits of conducting your own experiments. It's a good reminder that interesting ideas come through the process. I think if I use other characters' dialogue from the scene with my green screen shot, I think it would sell in the overall film. I believe I achieved a quality close to the Canine brothers technique in Kevin James' Soundman sketches, so in my view the experiment was a success. Drop me a comment if you've any suggestions, and cheers guys, I'll catch you in the next one.